Okay, so I'm sure this is going to be a little bit of a mess because I'm used to having the microphone sitting here and I use my hands and I flip through papers and I have my lecture on several different things here. So I'll probably ask you to bear with me a few times as I flip through the PowerPoints and my sheets. Well, thank you for coming and welcome to CVSB 203, the first common lecture. Hope you're all here for that. Today I'm just going to introduce you to the course in general, and I'm going to give you some general themes that you will perhaps look at with your instructors throughout the rest of the course. Ones that will be particularly relevant to the first introductory section of your readings, which includes three sets of texts. Copernicus is on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, which, as you might know, is the major text to reestablish, we got a construction site here, to reestablish the heliocentric or sun-centered model of the universe. I say reestablish because it existed in ancient times. It was proposed many times throughout history, but really came to be thought of as the model, at least for a little while, through the work of Copernicus, which you'll be reading. And that's a scientific treatise. As you read it, you'll see there's some nice introductory paragraphs and some early things about how astronomy makes your soul better and things like this. But for the most part, the book is just a bunch of mathematics and whatnot. So you're going to have to try to extract from that what it means for human beings, right? That's part of what we're doing in this course, as you did previously in your, say, 201 or 203 courses, reading texts to look for their human significance, human content. And since the modern period is, as we'll see, a scientific period, those scientific theories come to transform how we thought about ourselves. And you'll have to read those texts and try to see why that happened, right? So you're going to read for Copernicus as this kind of symbolic first text. Then there is a short text by Giordano Bruno. I'm going to talk about Bruno a little bit today, who was one of the major interpreters of the Copernican theory. So trying to express what it means. He wasn't a scientist, but he tried to express what it means for human beings to move from a Earth-centered to a sun-centered, or from a geocentric to a heliocentric model of the universe. And he even himself rejected the Copernican model, although he thought of himself as going beyond Copernicus, right? And the third text is a poem published quite a bit later, in the middle of the period we'll talk about in this course, by Alexander Pope, which is a poem that for many intellectuals functioned as the chief popular expression of what all those transformations that took place through Copernicus and early modern science meant to human beings, right? Meant for religion, meant for government, meant for morals and ethics and things like that, human value. So I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm glad they're taping this one. That's fine, I'll do it. I'll take care of it. Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's a little bit high. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, I was hoping to get through this part faster than usual, but I'll still try. First of all, I said I was getting ahead of myself because here in the beginning of my lecture, I want to tell you a little bit about what this course concerns, its scope and its content. And I want to do that, first of all, by outlining the geographical scope of the course. The course is called The Making of the Modern World. When you signed up for that, you probably had certain things in mind. As it turns out, it's not a great title for the course because we don't talk about the making of the entire modern world. In fact, we talk about, well, one very important but small part of the modern world, modern Europe, and the ideas that came out of early modern Europe, which would include, you would think, North America and Scandinavia and other regions, but we leave those out. In this course, it's such a complex and difficult period that we really do the best by focusing on a certain kind of geographical region that you would recognize here as Europe. It's, of course, part of the reason I put this map up here is because it's not exactly the Europe that you're familiar with, of course. We start this course looking at this area in Europe as it was at the very beginning of the modern period. So Copernicus's text is 1643, but going all the way back to 1550 or so would be when the intellectual revolutions and new thoughts that we're going to talk about in this course started to come up. And during that period, and over that period, from 1550 to the 1830s, that's the time scale that we cover in this course, Europe transformed from something you completely would not recognize. If you were just dropped, an alien picked you up, put you in a time machine and dropped you back there, you wouldn't recognize it geographically, culturally, intellectually, linguistically, anything of that sort. It would just be completely different. And one of the things that would be so very different, as I said, is the geographical, layout. So you can notice, even this is a bit of a lie. The Europe in that period, just before 1600, was so disorganized that we tend to, even when you see modern, you look up a modern map and you go to Google and you write Europe 1600, you're going to get a lie because they have to oversimplify things. But this one almost gets there. You can see it's almost like a fractal-like complexity in here. Each one of these is one little principality governed by an independent prince with his own knights and so on and so forth. Italy did not exist. Germany did not exist. France, in fact, did not really exist. It was more broken up than this, and it had various sub-rulers under the French king. England, okay, it looks all right there, but if you looked at, say, in the 1630s, what was called France here would suddenly go up all the way up into England and then go back down, and then this would be England would be down into here, and that's because they were fighting wars back and forth and conquering each other. I'm sure you're familiar with some of this. But point being, there was no such thing as general recognized national identities and borders and these kinds of things. All of that came about in the period we're going to read about in this course. And that took just that geographical fixity, the very idea of, say, having a country here, one country. You see it's partially Spanish, partially French, partially German, and so on. Of course, culturally, it had its own different regions, but none of those mapped onto Spanish or French or German. There was no match between geographic or boundaries of states and what you and I would call cultures or things like this. And that very idea that a country should be something that has a government that represents all the people and the people are unified through a certain common culture and certain common values, utterly unknown before 1600. And that's what's going on here. In part of this course, you're going to talk about ideas that were absolutely essential to eventually motivating people to say, hey, this thing called Italy, for instance, we all speak the same language. We should all be one country. We should overthrow all these little rulers and unify. So the unification of Italy, which took place in the 1800s, was a result of a lot of the ideas that you'll talk about. So there is some point here behind focusing a little bit on just the map and the difference that the map had at the beginning of the period we're going to talk about. So this course is restricted to talking about this area, right? Europe between about, as I said, 1550 and the 1830s. What is also often called, maybe to the surprise of some of you, the modern period, right? That's called the modern period. We're beyond it now. We're in something else. We leave out North America and all these other things, unfortunately. We'll just act as if we don't. So in this first part of the lecture, I'm going to go a little bit more depth about what Europe was like around 1600 to try to impress on you what had to be done intellectually, culturally, and so on to create the Europe that existed in, say, the 1830s, and for the most part still exists today. Of course, things have changed drastically, and I'm oversimplifying. But we'll see what that change is. I want to talk to you a little bit about the social, political, religious differences between 1600 and 1830, and then that sets the stage for what kind of work had to be done in the meantime, which work you will see done, represented, thought about, reflected on in all of the texts that you'll read in this course. So, if you were to, as I said, if an alien picked you up and transported you back to the to 1600, say, you would find yourself, maybe you read a few history books then when you settled, and you would find out that you were living in a time that was almost 100 years. It had been 100 years since the discovery of the Americas, right? So that was quite a while ago. For the earliest text you're going to read, the Americas and all the things that had been discovered over 100 years ago, right? And the globe had been circumnavigated, people were quite advanced, culture in Europe was quite advanced. By 1533, right, the Aztecs and the Incas had been conquered by Spain. And this is, of course, a major world history event. It's a major event in any respect. But also for Europeans, it was a major event because by about 100 years later, by about 1600, for the first time you had people starting to think about how much destruction they had committed and starting to reflect on how they should, maybe that's not the best way to relate towards other cultures and things. And this was starting to become an issue around 1600. At least some people were starting to reflect on it. About this time, as much as people might have regretted what they did in North America, other things that we come to see as not very pleasant started. During this period is really when the slave trade in Europe got going. People had gained a lot of money from conquering the Americas, particularly gold, which was used to trade with the East and get commerce, and that's why Spain and England and these countries became very, very wealthy. And then, of course, when they become wealthy, they can buy weapons and create weapons and fight each other. And they can also start to produce things, and they need slaves, and the slave trade is part of that. So by 1700, 100 years into the course you're going to read, Europe will be trading in about 6 to 12 million slaves worldwide. That should interest you because also you're going to see a lot of texts about the innate values of human beings and freedom and all kinds of things, and what's going on at the very same time is something to reflect on. And as I said, the silver and gold from that 100 years ago is still having its effect and fueling prosperity, but also war in Europe. So socially and politically, you've heard of, I suppose, the Protestant Revolution and Martin Luther. That was in around 1517 and continued to be a major issue throughout Europe, right? This battles between the Catholics and the Protestants. But until that time, right, just before that, Europe, the Catholic Church was basically the only European or pan-European institution, right? Something that everyone recognized and everyone was aware of. It determined, for the most part, the intellectual life of all people, right? If you were to become a scholar or something, you had to go to Catholic universities. All major universities were Catholic, right? The framework of education was Catholic for those who had education, right? The first Protestant universities only began in, say, the 1550s and through 75, and in Germany, I think the first Protestant university was in the 1690s, something like this. There was, until this time, no public education, right? There would be no general public services, no orphanages, no things to help people as just citizens. Even religious institutions for the poor were fairly scarce and were based upon whether you were a Catholic or whatnot. There were no public banks, no public services, no transportation. None of these things would be available in around 1600. The place and value, more importantly, of the individual would be determined by their place in a fairly rigid system determined by paternal lineage, so a kind of caste system, right, with distinct. Who you were the child of largely determined what your prospects in life were, right? More so than you might, you all, of course, know this to a certain extent, but the extent to which it really permeated every aspect of people's lives is quite shocking. Right? If you were part of the nobility, you were treated as inherently more valuable as a human being, right? You could bully, kill, destroy the land of peasants, and no one cared, right? This was actually a problem because the only people that possibly cared was the local prince who actually took all the crops and things created by the peasants. So when you came on your hunt and burned down their houses and destroyed their things, the prince might step in for them, but only because he's losing some of his own prosperity. But otherwise, it's fair game, right? So you had the nobility, you had the clergy, of course, was a very important system, and it had its own internal hierarchy, right? And if you were a clergy, interestingly, in the Catholic Church, if you were not students, if you were students in the period, you'd have to be students in the church, right? And if you were not under the political system of everyone else. You were under the special church political system. You had different laws that governed you, right? The church had quite a bit of independence and hierarchy, and of course it had its own legal system within it. Then there were merchants and guilds and so on, and if your father made horse saddles, that was what you would likely do, and that actually circumscribed his legal authority, right? People in guilds that were more important, he had no rights against, whereas he had rights against people who maybe were in less important guilds, and so on. So the guilds were kind of like what we now have, what are these called? I'll go on, I can't remember. And then you had peasants, right? So if you looked at the political history, if you read any history books about this time, you won't find any kind of discussions of movements of people or anything like this. What you will find is basically a history of struggles between families who were noble, who owned certain regions, conquered each other, then gave away parcels of land to their nephews and nieces and friends and brothers, and murdered each other within their family to gain areas. This is what the political history is like before 1600 in Europe, right? Someone who's born to the king of France will go over and become the wife of the king of England, and then after that the growth of French power in England will grow until eventually a French brother of her thinks that he should be the next king, and so on and so forth. This is how things go. And so even if you were, you look at the maps and you say it's still England, sometimes it's a French ruler or it's a German ruler, and you wouldn't even notice it, right? There were, of course, no human rights. This idea of human rights that you and I have heard so much about and seem to be dropped by God down into the world to make us all valuable as individual human beings. No one had heard of such a thing. No one certainly believed in such a thing. If you would come there and said, you're violating my rights as a human being, people would have been bewildered, right? So that's 1600. In this time, particularly in the Germanic regions, but pretty much all over, particularly between 1600 and 1650, all Europe was mired in religiously motivated wars, right? Wars between Catholics and Protestants. England was constantly in a state of civil war, more or less. It often concerned the conflicts between the Catholic Church and the king. Charles I, for instance, was beheaded in 1649 as part of one of the revolutions. And this had to do with the relationship of the king with respect to the parliament, right? The other nobles. All of continental Europe was ravaged by what was called the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. This killed at least 8 million people. You should think about this when you're reading these texts. What was going on and why were these people so concerned with these issues? Well, Europe was largely devastated, particularly Central Europe, by these wars. 8 million people, as I said, died. Some German states lost as much as 75% of their population to famine, plague, and war. One famous writer said at the time that after the 30 Years' War, the only thing left in Germany were prostitutes and corpses, right? Because that's what wars leave behind. Of course, sickness comes. You have no social structure. Europe was suffering immensely. And so when you're reading through this course about all the optimism and the hope that science is going to revolutionize and bring make things better, and that we need to turn to the world around us and change it, read this, see this in the background, right? This is hope against all these things that have happened. Another important thing that happened, of course, during times of tumult and lack of structure and breaking up of that system of the Catholic Church and these wars, people become more superstitious, right? And so superstition became particularly a focal point of European discussion at the time. Until about 1650, or until about 1750, it was fairly common to see people executed for being witches and other things. And during this time, there were plenty of books published. Some of about how you find out that someone is a is a witch or not. You know, if you watch Monty Python and the Holy Grail and they're trying to see if a woman sinks or floats, you know, to decide if she's a witch. This is not a joke. It sounds like a joke to us, but these kinds of things were really going on. And part of the Enlightenment, you know, as much as some people may not like the Enlightenment, one of the central strains of the Enlightenment is the idea that science tells us these things are not true, that we should stop burning innocent people that maybe have mental illness or something like that. So a lot of the Enlightenment figures that you will read here, or their friends, also were publishing books against prosecuting people for being witches and such things. So superstition was a major issue. Now, intellectually, the framework for science and philosophy during the period before 1600 were largely determined by an unstable fusion between the philosophy of Aristotle, who was so much the philosopher people referred to that in most Catholic treatises of the time, he's just referred to as the philosopher, right? He's the one that you refer to. So it was a mixture between his philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy of Aristotle, and Catholic doctrine. And that pretty much outlined the way people thought about the world, what you would learn when you were educated, the logic you would learn in Catholic education would be the logic of Aristotle. The physics you would learn would be the physics of Aristotle. The metaphysics and philosophy you would learn would be the philosophy of Aristotle. The biology you would learn would largely be the biology of Aristotle or of followers of Aristotle. But these things would be limited by Catholic doctrine, right? So for instance, Aristotle believed that there was a pretty good proof that the world was eternal. Catholics couldn't quite accept that, right? So they had to correct Aristotle on certain issues. Thinkers during this period, if you were a thinker, you know, a philosopher, largely, if you study medieval philosophy, you may not even know whether someone is French or English or Italian. National identities don't seem to have anything to do with the intellectual system. It's fixed by religion and by Aristotle's philosophy. So the scholars would just travel all around. They all wrote in Latin. They all spoke to one another. And this, as I said, this is in no way determined by their origins. You'll see this changes very much in the course that you're reading. Then for the first time, people will think of themselves, I'm an English writer. I'm a French writer. What does that mean? What does that mean for how I think about philosophy, right? I'm a German writer, for instance, or I'm an Italian writer. There were, around 1600, no funded institutions for science. This is very, very important. There was no idea that kings or whatnot should be interested in science, fund science, that science was something valuable for the good of people. It was studied. You will find in the medieval period people doing interesting science, not a lot of it, but definitely doing it. And they largely do it, as you find out, for their own spiritual edification, right? They study the world because God created the world. And even then, though, people are not so sure because there's easier ways, right? Study the Bible. Why would you study rainbows or something? But still, people did it. But the idea that you would do it generally for some purpose, for improving the world, for these kinds of things, no one thought of this, right? It had to be fought for. And Francis Bacon, you will read a text by Francis Bacon, or a couple of texts by Francis Bacon, and he spent his life writing books trying to convince people that they should invest in a rather enormously complex system, institutional system of scientific investigation. And it did lead somewhere. Finally, the first Royal Society devoted to science was created in Britain, the Royal Society of Britain in 1660. And on their first transactions of the Academy, there's a bust of Francis Bacon, because he is the father. And that model then started to spread throughout Europe. It was the French Academy soon followed in 1666, and then the Prussian Academy of Sciences. Germany was so devastated by the wars that they always lag in everything in the modern period. They got their act together by around 1700. To create, what are these scientific institutions? They're places where you would present papers with discoveries to the public. It's for the public, and of course to the scholarly public, and they would be published. I said transactions. So before these, 1660, there was no such thing as a scientific journal. There's no such thing as public presentation of knowledge for the sake of the general community. That was a radically new idea. And journals, what is the heart of science now? If any of you, some of you are scientists or want to be scientists or studying to be scientists, your life will be governed by journals. Do you succeed in the journals or not? And that's for a reason, because journals are there to peer review. It's part of the process of keeping us from falling into error. You'll see this as part of Bacon's idea, is that we need to compare our ideas with others and criticize them and present them publicly and try to eliminate our own prejudices and so on. And that's what's part of the central idea behind journals and peer review. So in this course, you'll see some of the arguments presented for why such a thing is necessary. And of course, those arguments succeeded wonderfully. Until almost 1700, the only way to do proper scientific research was by finding a wealthy patron. So as I said, there was no public funding for science. So if you, even, someone Galileo, Galileo, of course, is after Copernicus. But even in this period, the only way he could do science was by finding some wealthy person whose children he could